Secretive knights once held more diplomatic sway than kings. This is the hidden history of the Knights Templar, an order whose quiet negotiations and back-channel dealings did far more than fund crusades. They redirected the very fate of nations. By the end of this journey, you will understand 23 precise moments where Templar diplomacy, operating from the shadows, permanently altered the course of medieval history. How did a religious military order become the trusted banker to empires? What whispered agreement allowed them to reclaim a fortress without a single sword drawn? Their story reveals a legacy of power built not on the battlefield, but in sealed letters and discreet meetings. What do you believe is the true source of lasting influence? Within the hushed stone halls of a French cathedral, a small council of powerful men made a decision that would echo for centuries. The year was 1129. At the Council of Troyes, a group of knights, initially just 9 in number and dedicated to protecting pilgrims, received something far more valuable than land or gold. They were granted official papal recognition as an independent religious order. This was not merely a blessing, it was a legal and spiritual revolution. With a stroke of a pen, the Templars were elevated. They were no longer just warriors subject to the whims of local bishops or feudal lords. They became a sovereign entity within the very structure of the Church, answering directly and only to the Pope himself. This unique status was the absolute bedrock of everything that followed. It made them untouchable. Imagine a local king furious with a neighboring ruler, but unable to communicate directly without losing face. He could not trust his own messengers, and his own bishops had political agendas. But the Templars, they operated on a different plane. They were the perfect neutral intermediaries. A Templar knight could ride from Paris to Jerusalem, his person and his correspondence protected by divine sanction. His word was trusted because his loyalty was not to a crown, but to an ideal that transcended borders. This autonomy allowed them to build the first truly international banking network, moving vast sums of money across war-torn continents because everyone, from emperor to merchant, trusted their neutrality. They became a law unto themselves, a power that could negotiate secret truces, arrange prisoner swaps, and fund armies where kings and princes were utterly powerless. This foundational power, granted in that quiet cathedral, set the stage for their first and most stunning diplomatic victory, a moment where they would not just observe history, but actively bend its course. Chaos erupted in the coastal city of Tripoli. The count was dead, leaving no clear adult heir, only a child named Raymond. The powerful local barons saw an opportunity, each maneuvering to seize control. The church was deeply concerned about stability, and neighboring Christian lords watched, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. The entire northern flank of the Crusader states was on the verge of tearing itself apart in a bloody civil war. Into this volatile situation rode the white-mantled Knights of the Temple. They were not there as conquerors, but as the only credible mediators everyone would actually listen to. Why them? Because they possessed what every local faction lacked: impartiality. The Templars had no lands in the county to covet, no ancient family rivalries to settle. Their sole stated interest was the security and strength of Outremer, the Crusader lands. They convened the warring barons, spoke with bishops, and assured foreign powers. Their message was simple: a fractured Tripoli was a prize for their enemies, but a united one under the legitimate heir, the boy Raymond III, was a bulwark. They used their immense moral authority, backed by the quiet threat of their own formidable military force, to broker a consensus. A regency was established. The barons agreed to support the young count, and a disastrous internal conflict was averted. This was not a battle won with swords, but with quiet persuasion and unshakable credibility. It proved the Templars were more than just soldiers. They were masterful political operators who could hold a kingdom together with nothing but their reputation. This success in Tripoli was merely their opening move on a much larger diplomatic chessboard, a board where the king himself was about to become the most valuable piece. The royal court of Jerusalem was a house divided. A bitter struggle for power erupted between a determined young king, Baldwin III, and his formidable mother, Queen Melisende. This was not a simple family quarrel. It was a civil war that threatened to shatter the most important Christian kingdom in the Holy Land. Their conflict split the nobility, paralyzed the government, and left the realm vulnerable to its enemies at the worst possible moment. Both sides possessed legitimate claims and both had powerful supporters, but neither Baldwin nor Melisende could truly trust their own barons, whose loyalties shifted with the political winds. They needed a mediator who stood above the fray, an entity whose only allegiance was to the kingdom's survival. They turned to the Knights Templar. Why were the Templars the only acceptable arbiters for both the king and the queen? Their influence was now so deeply woven into the fabric of the realm that they were indispensable. They held vast estates granted by the crown, commanded key fortresses, and their military order was the backbone of the kingdom's defense. More importantly, they had provided financial backing to both sides of the royal family at different times. They were not outsiders, they were stakeholders with a proven record of impartial judgment. The Templars entered the negotiations with a clear, pragmatic goal: to stop the bleeding and preserve the kingdom. They did not take sides based on personal loyalty. They worked to broker a solution that would end the fighting and restore a semblance of unity. Their proposal was a masterstroke of political compromise, a formal partition of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The coastal cities around Jerusalem, including the vital port of Acre, would remain under Queen Melisende's control, acknowledging her experience and established power base. Baldwin III, the anointed king, would rule from the inland capital of Jerusalem and lead the kingdom's military efforts. This diplomatic settlement, enforced in 1152 and solidified over the following year, was a triumph of realpolitik over pride. The Templars used their immense moral authority and the unspoken threat of withdrawing their financial and military support to impose this peace. They convinced a mother and son to divide their inheritance to save it from total destruction. This was not a permanent fix, but it was a necessary one. It prevented a prolonged civil war that would have certainly ended with the collapse of the entire Crusader project. By successfully managing this royal rift, the Templars cemented their role as the ultimate power brokers. They proved that their diplomatic services were not just helpful, but absolutely essential for the survival of the Crusader states. Their ability to command the ear of kings and queens, to negotiate between warring factions, and to enforce compromises with their unmatched resources set a powerful precedent. They were no longer just knights or bankers, they were the hidden architects of stability, and their influence was about to extend far beyond the borders of any single kingdom. By the late 12th century, the Holy Land was a chessboard of exhaustion. The Third Crusade, led by the legendary Richard the Lionheart of England, had reached a bloody stalemate against the equally formidable Sultan Saladin. Both armies were depleted, supplies were low, and the prize of Jerusalem remained just out of reach. The two titans were locked in a war neither could decisively win, and the path to peace required a mediator who could navigate the immense pride and deep suspicions on both sides. The white-mantled Knights Templar became the indispensable channel for these delicate talks. They were the only messengers both Richard and Saladin would trust without question. A Templar could ride into the Muslim camp without fear of being taken hostage, and he could return to the Christian lines without being accused of treason. Their value went far beyond safe passage. For decades, the Templars had cultivated an intimate, ground-level understanding of the region that kings and sultans, who were often newcomers, simply lacked. They knew which mountain passes were negotiable in the rainy season, which local sheikhs could be relied upon, and the subtle points of Islamic law and custom that could make or break an agreement. As they shuttled tirelessly between the two camps, they did more than just carry proposals. They clarified terms, offered quiet counsel, and translated not just languages but intentions. They advised Richard on the practical realities of holding territory, explaining which coastal castles were truly defensible and which were strategic liabilities. To Saladin, they provided assurances of Christian sincerity, their word carrying a weight that no other emissaries could. The resulting Treaty of Ramla in 1192 was a masterpiece of pragmatic compromise, and the Templar fingerprint was all over it. While Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, the treaty guaranteed safe passage for Christian pilgrims, ensuring the spiritual and economic lifeblood of the Crusader states continued to flow. The fragile peace it created was not a victory for either side, but a necessary respite brokered by the one organization that saw the entire board clearly. This was perhaps their most visible diplomatic achievement on the world stage, proving that their unique blend of martial piety and worldly savvy could shape the fate of empires. Their role as peacemakers between such legendary figures cemented their reputation as the ultimate neutral party, a reputation they would now carry back to the heart of Europe, where even greater financial empires awaited their touch. Far from the dusty battlefields of the Holy Land, a different kind of war was consuming the south of France. The Albigensian Crusade was a brutal campaign of doctrine and dominion, pitting the northern French crown against the Cathar heretics of Languedoc. Armies marched, castles fell, and the conflict seemed a world away from the Templars' sacred mission in Jerusalem. Yet, it was here that their financial power quietly redirected the fate of a nation. The order made a calculated decision. They would not raise their banners in this fight, avoiding the messy internal politics of a war between Christians. Instead, they offered a service far more valuable to King Philip II than any company of knights, the full force of their international banking system. While French barons led the charge, the Templars managed the entire war economy from the shadows. They became the royal treasury on the move, securely transferring vast sums of gold from Paris to the front lines across hundreds of miles of hostile or uncertain territory. Local lords could not be trusted with such riches, and bandits lurked on every road, but a Templar caravan, protected by the fear of God and the order's formidable reputation, moved without interference. Their preceptories, those fortified monasteries dotting the countryside, became more than just banks. They transformed into neutral spaces for tense negotiations. When local truces were needed or disputes arose between crusading commanders, they met under the Templar cross, knowing the order had no territorial stake in the outcome, only a vested interest in stability. This financial backbone allowed King Philip to project power with an efficiency previously unimaginable. He could pay his armies, supply his sieges, and fund his allies, all without the gold ever touching a potentially treacherous hand. The conquest of Languedoc was, in many ways, a Templar-funded enterprise. They demonstrated that controlling the flow of money could shape royal policy as decisively as any battlefield victory, a quiet form of diplomacy that built empires without a single sword drawn. This mastery over capital was a power kings could not ignore, and it would soon draw the order into an even grander and more perilous financial partnership, one that would place the crown itself in their debt. A king's power can vanish when his treasury runs dry. For King John of England, the year 1210 was a perfect storm of disaster. He was locked in a brutal struggle with his own barons, who were outraged by his heavy taxes and autocratic rule. To make matters infinitely worse, Pope Innocent III had placed the entire kingdom under a papal interdict, effectively excommunicating the realm. Churches fell silent, sacraments were forbidden, and the spiritual life of the nation ground to a halt. The king was isolated, despised, and critically bankrupt. His own tax collectors could not gather funds from a rebellious nobility, and his most loyal mercenaries threatened to desert without pay. The very foundations of his reign were crumbling into dust. In this moment of absolute crisis, only one institution in London possessed both the colossal wealth and the political neutrality to intervene. The Templars' new temple, their English headquarters, was not just a church, it was the largest financial clearinghouse in the kingdom, a fortress of gold. They made a calculated decision to extend a massive, secret loan to the desperate king. This was not an act of charity, it was a strategic investment in stability. The infusion of Templar capital allowed King John to do the one thing he desperately needed: pay his army. With his mercenaries loyal, he could temporarily stave off the baronial revolt and maintain a tenuous grip on his throne. The true nature of this transaction, however, was its profound secrecy. No public record announced the loan, no royal decree thanked the order. It was a clandestine arrangement buried in the temple's private ledgers. This silence was the source of the Templars' real power. For years following the loan, the order held a hidden lever over English royal policy. King John, and later his son, knew their financial survival could depend on the Templars' continued goodwill. The order's influence was not shouted from the ramparts, but whispered in the royal council chamber. This single financial maneuver demonstrated a chilling truth: the Templars could now prop up a failing monarchy with nothing more than a line of credit. Their wealth had become a geopolitical weapon, one they would soon wield on an even grander scale, quietly redirecting the fate of France itself. The same financial power that kept King John on his throne would soon contain the very rebellion against him. In the tense spring of 1215, the king and his furious barons needed a place to meet, a ground both sides could deem neutral and secure. The royal palaces were out of the question, thick with the king's men. The barons' own halls were no safer. There was only one location in London that offered both formidable protection and an unimpeachable aura of impartiality: the New Temple, the international headquarters of the Knights Templar in England. Within its fortified walls, a political storm was brewing. The rebellious barons were not seeking to overthrow the crown, but to bind it, to force the king to acknowledge that his power had limits. These were treasonous ideas to a monarch like John, and discussing them required a sanctuary beyond his immediate reach. The Templars provided exactly that. Their compound was a sovereign island protected by papal decree and their own fearsome reputation. Here, in the temple's halls, the impossible began to seem possible. Templar brothers, skilled in law and diplomacy, did more than just provide the room. They acted as scribes, meticulously recording the clauses of the Great Charter. They served as witnesses, their presence lending the document a weight that went beyond the secular. A promise made under the gaze of God's own warriors carried a different kind of authority. Some of the order's most senior members, men who had negotiated with sultans and popes, offered quiet counsel, shaping the language of compromise. Their involvement transformed a raw political confrontation into a legitimate legal proceeding. By hosting the negotiations and embedding themselves in the process, the Templars helped channel a violent rebellion into a written settlement. The Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede but born in the Templar precincts, was a direct result of this facilitated confrontation. The Order's role was not about taking sides, but about ensuring the conflict produced a document rather than a massacre. In doing so, they placed their immense moral authority behind the revolutionary idea that a king was not above the law. Their house became a crucible for English liberty, a quiet testament to their power to redirect the course of a nation not with loans alone, but by offering a table where enemies could finally, safely talk. This mastery over the very spaces of power would soon be tested again, as another kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse, calling them to an even more dramatic intervention. A king's death on a foreign battlefield sent shockwaves through his kingdom. When King Peter II of Aragon fell at the Battle of Muret in 1213, he left behind a realm in peril and an heir who was just a small boy. The crown of Aragon, a rising power in the Iberian Peninsula, now teetered on the brink of a civil war. Powerful noble factions saw a chance to seize control, each vying to influence the regency for the child king, James I. The kingdom's very unity, so crucial to the ongoing fight against Muslim powers in the south, was at stake. Into this power vacuum stepped the only force with the credibility to hold the competing interests together, the Knights Templar. The Order was no stranger to Aragon. They were among the kingdom's largest landowners, granted vast estates and castles by previous monarchs in gratitude for their military support. Their preceptories were fortresses of both faith and finance, making them deeply embedded stakeholders in the region's stability. They moved quickly, using their network of commanderies as neutral ground for urgent meetings. Templar officials mediated between the warring noble houses and the official Regency Council, their white mantles a constant reminder of an authority that transcended local squabbles. Their argument was pragmatic and powerful. A fractured Aragon would be a gift to its enemies, but a united kingdom under its legitimate heir would continue the Reconquista and secure its future. The Templars threw their immense weight behind the young James, lending his claim their unmatched moral and financial authority. Their endorsement was the final piece that secured the boy's throne, ensuring a smooth transition of power that prevented the kingdom from splintering. In return for this service, the future King James I, who would earn the name the Conqueror for his spectacular campaigns, never forgot the order that secured his crown. He became one of their greatest and most generous patrons, granting them new lands, privileges, and a permanent role in his court. This single act of arbitration transformed the Templars from powerful allies into genuine kingmakers on the Iberian Peninsula. Their ability to anoint a monarch demonstrated a level of influence that rivaled any pope or emperor, proving that their quiet diplomacy could not only save kingdoms but also launch the reigns of legends. Even the most sacred relics have a price. In 1239, the crown of thorns itself, believed to have been placed on Jesus Christ before his crucifixion, was held not in a church but as collateral by Venetian merchants. The cost to redeem it was astronomical, a sum so vast it was beyond the immediate reach of even the most pious king. For King Louis IX of France, a man determined to transform his kingdom into the spiritual heart of Europe, obtaining this relic was a divine necessity. But moving such a fortune across a continent required more than faith. It demanded a financial network no secular power possessed. The Templars became the silent engine of this holy transaction. They did not merely loan the gold, they orchestrated its entire journey. Their ships carried the payment from France to Venice, their armed guards protected it from thieves, and their trusted agents verified the authenticity of the sacred crown before its release. This was a masterclass in financial logistics, all conducted under the absolute veil of Templar security. For King Louis, their involvement was a guarantee of success, transforming a risky purchase into a divinely sanctioned certainty. When the crown of thorns finally arrived in Paris, it was a triumph that elevated the French monarchy to unprecedented heights. Louis was no longer just a king, he was a holy patron, the guardian of Christendom's greatest treasure. The magnificent Sainte-Chapelle was built as a reliquary worthy of the crown, a glittering testament to this new spiritual prestige, and behind it all stood the Templars. This transaction cemented an unbreakable bond between the order and the French crown. They had proven that their power could secure not just kingdoms, but salvation itself, making them the indispensable financial architects of a new holy empire in the heart of Paris. Their influence now flowed as much through the veins of sacred diplomacy as it did through commerce, a fusion of power that made them untouchable and, for the moment, utterly essential to the destiny of France. The fortress of Safed was a ghost haunting the Templar high command. Perched on a Galilean hilltop, this formidable castle had been the northern bulwark of their kingdom, a linchpin in the defense of Acre. Its loss to the Ayyubids was a strategic wound that bled their authority daily. To reclaim it by force would require a massive army and a siege that could cost thousands of lives, a price the dwindling Crusader states could no longer afford. So the Templars chose a different weapon, one they had honed to a razor's edge: negotiation. They turned their gaze not to the battlefield, but to the court of the Emir of Damascus, Al-Salih Ismail, a ruler besieged not by Christians but by his own Muslim rivals. His grip on power was fragile, threatened by the rising power of the Egyptians and his own rebellious nephews. The Templars saw his vulnerability not as a weakness to exploit, but as an opportunity for a mutually beneficial deal. They initiated a series of discreet, protracted talks, a diplomatic dance that stretched over months. What did they offer the emir? Their proposal was a masterclass in realpolitik. In exchange for the peaceful return of Safed, the Templars extended a promise of military support, a pledge to stand with Damascus against its enemies. This was an alliance that crossed the deepest ideological divide of the age, a Christian military order offering its sword to a Muslim emir. There were likely substantial financial sweeteners as well, Templar gold smoothing the path of the agreement. For Al-Salih Ismail, the calculus was clear. A friendly, powerful neighbor to his west, bought with a stone castle he was struggling to hold, was far more valuable than a ruined fortress and a new enemy. The deal was struck in 1240. Without a single arrow fired, the Templar banner once again flew over the battlements of Safed. This was not a triumph of faith, but of cold, pragmatic statecraft. It revealed a diplomatic sophistication that shocked their contemporaries, a willingness to see beyond the crusading rhetoric and engage with the complex political realities of the Near East. Their influence now reached confidently into the courts of their supposed enemies, proving that true power often resided not in the sword, but in the quiet, calculated offer of an alliance. Far to the west of Jerusalem, another war was tearing the Mediterranean world in two. The War of the Sicilian Vespers was a sprawling, vicious conflict that erupted in 1282, pitting the French House of Anjou against the Spanish crown of Aragon in a brutal fight for control of Sicily. This was not just a regional squabble, it was a proxy war that drew in the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and every major power with an interest in the Mediterranean. The entire political landscape of southern Europe was fracturing, and the usual channels of diplomacy had collapsed into distrust. Into this chaos, the Knights Templar stepped forward, not with an army, but with an offer to mediate. Their unique position made them the only conceivable neutral ground. They held vast estates and commanded deep respect in the domains of both the Angevin Charles I and the Aragonese Peter III. A Templar preceptory became the one place where emissaries from the warring factions, and even from the papal curia itself, could meet without immediate fear of betrayal. For years, Templar officials shuttled between Naples, Barcelona, and Rome, carrying proposals and counter-proposals. They hosted preliminary talks within their fortified houses, their white mantles a symbol of a temporary truce. The sheer complexity of the conflict was staggering, involving claims of royal legitimacy, papal overlordship, and the raw ambition of empires. The Templars navigated it all, leveraging their unparalleled intelligence network to understand the true motivations of each player. While they could not broker a final, lasting peace in a war so deeply entrenched, their involvement was a diplomatic triumph in its own right. It gave the order an intimate, front-row seat to the secret ambitions and shifting alliances of every major court in Europe. They knew which cardinal was in whose pocket, which king was bluffing about his military strength, and which noble was on the verge of switching sides. This role as the indispensable information hub in one of the century's greatest conflicts was a stark demonstration of their perceived impartiality. They were no longer just bankers or warriors. They were the keepers of the continent's most dangerous secrets, a position of quiet power that would, in time, make them a threat too great for any one king to ignore. The world had never seen a power like the Mongol Empire. From the steppes of Asia, their armies swept westward, an unstoppable tide that shattered kingdoms and redrawn maps. To most of Europe, they were a biblical scourge, a nameless terror from the east. Yet the Knights Templar, watching from their fortresses in the Holy Land, saw something else entirely, a potential ally. In the 1260s, as the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt grew ever stronger, threatening to push the last Crusader states into the sea, the Templars made a decision that defied all convention. They initiated secret, exploratory talks with the Mongol Ilkhanate, the very force that had recently sacked Baghdad. This was not just diplomacy, it was geopolitical heresy. The idea of a Christian military order, sworn to defend the faith, seeking an alliance with pagan horsemen was almost unthinkable. But the Templars were not bound by the fears of distant bishops. They were pragmatic survivors, their emissaries, likely traveling along ancient trade routes under the guise of merchants, carried a radical proposal to the Mongol commanders. They discussed the outlines of a grand pincer movement, a coordinated attack where the Mongol armies would strike the Mamluks from the east, while the Crusader forces, led by the Templars, pressed from the west. This was a vision of statecraft on a continental scale, a plan to crush their common enemy between two hammers. The sheer ambition of these clandestine contacts reveals a leadership thinking centuries ahead of its time. They understood that the survival of their cause might require setting aside ideology and embracing a larger, more dangerous world. Though the full Franco-Mongol alliance never truly coalesced, these tentative negotiations stand as a testament to their unique position. They were the only power in Christendom with the global reach, the audacity, and the sheer nerve to even attempt such a partnership. This forward-thinking approach, this willingness to look beyond the horizon for salvation, marked them as players on a world stage, but it also sowed the seeds of suspicion. If they could treat with pagans, what other lines would they cross? Their visionary diplomacy was saving their world, yet it was also making them dangerously different from everyone else. A king's ambition is an expensive thing. As the Kingdom of France grew from a patchwork of feudal lands into a centralized state under King Philip III and his son, Philip IV, its financial needs exploded. Funding armies, building infrastructure, and running a burgeoning bureaucracy required a constant, massive flow of capital, something the old feudal system simply could not provide. There was only one institution in Paris sophisticated enough to manage the royal fortune, the Templars' fortress known as the Paris Temple. This compound was not merely a bank, it was the beating financial heart of the French monarchy. Within its heavily guarded vaults lay the crown's treasure, its jewels, its most sensitive state documents, and the collected tax revenues from across the realm. The Templars did not just store this wealth, they actively managed it. They advanced enormous loans to fund the king's wars and ambitious building projects, effectively becoming the crown's indispensable credit line. Templar officials, with their meticulous record-keeping and international network, handled the complex transfers of money that kept the royal government functioning. This relationship went far beyond a simple business arrangement. The order now had a front-row seat to every royal secret. They knew the exact state of the treasury, the size of the king's debts, and the intimate details of his foreign policy gambits. They were not just financiers, they were silent partners in governance, their influence woven into the very fabric of the state. This deep entanglement brought them immense power, but it also created a profound and dangerous dependency. The French crown was now living on Templar credit, and a king who feels himself in debt to a power he cannot control is a king who will eventually see that power not as a partner, but as a threat. The very intimacy of this financial bond, which stabilized France for decades, was quietly forging the instruments of the order's own destruction. A king's death can shatter a kingdom, but the death of an heir can shatter a dynasty. When the young Margaret, the Maid of Norway and the last direct descendant of Scotland's royal line, perished on her voyage to claim the throne, she left behind a political storm. 13 powerful nobles stepped forward, each brandishing ancient lineage and legal claims to the crown. The nation stood on the brink of a civil war that would have torn its very fabric apart. In this chaos of competing ambitions, where could the Scottish magnates turn for a judgment all would accept? The final arbitration fell to the formidable King Edward I of England, a decision fraught with its own perils. Yet before Edward's verdict could be rendered, the groundwork for this high-stakes tribunal had to be laid. It is here, in the hushed preliminary discussions, that the shadow of the Templars falls across the history books. As one of the largest and most respected international bodies in Scotland, with vast estates and commanderies dotting the landscape, they were the natural neutral ground. Their impartiality was beyond question, their word trusted by all factions precisely because their ultimate loyalty was not to any Scottish clan or the English crown, but to a higher transnational authority. While records are sparse, their potential role as preliminary arbiters in what became known as the Great Cause is a compelling likelihood. Templar officials, skilled in canon and civil law, would have been the ideal facilitators for those first, tense meetings where the complex web of competing claims was untangled. Their involvement provided a layer of legitimacy to a process that would ultimately decide the fate of a nation. This quiet, behind-the-scenes role demonstrates the extraordinary trust placed in the order. From the sun-baked courts of Jerusalem to the misty halls of Scottish lords, they were seen as the one institution that could stand above the fray, their white mantles a symbol of impartial judgment in a world clouded by ambition and greed. This universal credibility was their greatest asset, a form of soft power that made them indispensable, yet it was also making them a silent rival to the very kings they served. The walls of Acre were crumbling. After nearly 200 years, the final bastion of the Crusader states was being pounded into dust by Mamluk siege engines. The city descended into a nightmare of fire, smoke, and desperate street fighting. In this absolute chaos, the Templars faced their ultimate test, while their Grand Master, William de Beaujeu, made a heroic last stand and fell in the defense of a city gate. A different, quieter drama was unfolding at the Templar fortress by the sea. Senior officials of the order, realizing the battle was irrevocably lost, switched their objective from victory to survival. Their galleys, the most formidable ships in the harbor, represented the last hope of escape. But how could they possibly organize an evacuation with the enemy pouring through the breaches? The answer lay in their long-honed diplomatic skill. Even as swords clashed in the streets, these Templars opened a channel with the Mamluk commanders. They negotiated not for the city, which was already doomed, but for a precious commodity, time. They brokered a temporary, localized truce, a brief window that allowed for a controlled withdrawal from their fortified compound to the waiting ships. This was not a rout, it was a meticulously managed retreat. Under the cover of this desperate agreement, they managed to evacuate not only their own remaining knights and a vast portion of their treasury, but also thousands of civilians, soldiers from other orders, and noble families who would have otherwise been slaughtered or enslaved. The fall of Acre was a profound military and spiritual catastrophe for Christendom, a definitive end of an era. Yet, because of this final act of crisis diplomacy, it was not the end of the Knights Templar. Their negotiated escape turned a total annihilation into an organized retreat to the island kingdom of Cyprus. They had saved the core of their institution, their wealth, their command structure, and most importantly, their legendary network of contacts and influence. Though they were now exiles, the machine of Templar power remained intact, ready to be redeployed from a new base. This tragic masterstroke of disaster management proved that their true strength was not in holding ground, but in knowing when and how to fall back in order to fight another day. Their survival ensured their story was far from over, and their financial empire, now untethered from its holy purpose, would soon cast a shadow that even a king could not ignore. Exiled from the Holy Land, the Templars did not fade into obscurity. They regrouped on the sun-drenched island of Cyprus, transforming it from a refuge into a formidable new nerve center of power. The Lusignan kings of Cyprus, rulers of a strategically vital but politically complex kingdom, quickly discovered they were hosting a force far greater than a band of displaced knights. The Templar treasury, salvaged from the fall of Acre, was now the largest single source of capital on the island. Their military expertise was unparalleled, and their network of international contacts spanned from London to Alexandria. The Lusignans, in essence, found themselves with a shadow government residing within their own borders. The Templars became the indispensable power behind the Cypriot throne, serving as the monarchy's chief financiers, its most trusted military advisors, and its most effective diplomatic agents. When the kingdom needed to negotiate a trade treaty with the wealthy merchant republics of Venice or Genoa, it was a Templar envoy who sat at the table, his orders' financial leverage ensuring favorable terms. When the Lusignans sought a strategic marriage alliance with the Kingdom of Cilician Armenia, it was the Templars who facilitated the delicate discussions, their reputation for neutrality allowing them to navigate the intricate web of royal pride and political advantage. This was statecraft adapted to an insular environment. On an island, every resource is magnified, and the Templars' resources were colossal. They used their wealth to fortify the kingdom's defenses and their diplomatic skill to punch far above its weight in Mediterranean politics. They made the small kingdom of Cyprus a major player, not through conquest, but through the quiet, calculated application of influence. From their new island base, the white-mantled knights continued to redirect the fates of nations, proving that their true power had never been the land they held, but the connections they cultivated and the gold they commanded. Whispers can be more dangerous than swords. As the 14th century dawned, a low murmur of envy and suspicion began to swirl around the Knights Templar. Their incredible wealth, their secretive ways, and their independence from any king made them a target for those who feared their power. The most dangerous of these whispers were reaching the ears of the French crown. Sensing the gathering storm, the Templar leadership knew they had to act. Their survival depended on their oldest and most powerful ally, the papacy itself. They launched a discreet but intense diplomatic campaign, a flood of carefully worded letters and trusted emissaries sent directly to the court of Pope Boniface VIII. This was not a public relations effort. It was a high-stakes lobbying mission conducted in the hushed corridors of the Vatican. Their message was meticulously crafted. They reaffirmed their absolute loyalty to the Holy See, reminding the Pope that they answered to him and him alone. They detailed their indispensable role as the financial engine for any future crusade, the only institution capable of moving the vast sums required to reclaim the Holy Land. They presented themselves not as a rogue state within the Church, but as its most disciplined and useful servants, the steadfast defenders of Christendom's frontiers, even from their exile on Cyprus. This was a preemptive diplomatic strike, a brilliant attempt to fortify their walls in Rome before their enemies could lay siege. For a time, it worked. Pope Boniface, a formidable and strong-willed pontiff himself, was a receptive audience. He understood the Templars' value and the dangerous precedent of a secular king attacking an order that reported directly to the papacy. This secret correspondence bought the order precious time, but it also revealed a profound vulnerability. They were now playing a defensive game, relying on the protection of a single, powerful man in a world where power was always shifting. Their fate was no longer solely in their own hands, but tangled in the threads of papal politics, a dangerous place to be when a king's patience was finally running out. Unity was the last thing the Templars wanted. By 1306, the idea of merging the Templars with their longtime rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, was being seriously debated in the highest circles of power. To kings and popes weary of funding two massive military orders, it seemed a logical solution, a way to streamline costs and create a single, efficient force for a future crusade. But for the Templars, this proposal was an existential threat. They launched a diplomatic counteroffensive, leveraging every connection they had cultivated over 2 centuries. Their arguments, delivered in private audiences and carefully penned memoranda to the Pope, were passionate and precise. They defended their unique identity, their distinct rule, and their specialized mission. They were not just warriors, they were international bankers and diplomats, a role the more hospital-focused Hospitallers could not easily fill. To merge would be to dissolve their entire way of life, to lose the very independence that made them so effective. Their political network, still formidable, went to work, quietly lobbying cardinals and influencing royal advisors to see the flaws in the unification plan. They stalled, they debated, they obfuscated, using the very machinery of medieval bureaucracy to protect themselves. In the short term, their diplomatic resistance was a stunning success. The merger proposal was effectively tabled, dying a quiet death in committee rooms and private chambers. They had won, preserving their sovereignty for a little while longer. But this victory came at a terrible, hidden cost. Their fierce and very public fight to remain separate confirmed their enemies' darkest suspicions. It proved the Templars were not a pliable tool to be reshaped for royal convenience, but a stubborn, independent power that would fight to the bitter end to protect its own interests. Their successful defiance made them look less like loyal servants of Christendom and more like a state within a state, an entity too proud and too powerful to be controlled. In saving themselves from amalgamation, they may have signed their own death warrant, convincing a desperate French king that negotiation was futile and that only annihilation would suffice. No institution, not even one backed by divine sanction, is immune to the shifting tides of earthly power. The new century found the Templars caught in a vise between 2 of the most formidable men in Europe, a weak pope and a desperate king. Pope Clement V, the first pontiff to rule from Avignon under the shadow of the French crown, was a man of deep conflict. He held a genuine belief in the Templars' innocence and value, but his position was perilously weak. His every decision was scrutinized by his host and patron, King Philip IV of France, a monarch known as Philip the Fair for his looks, but not his temperament. Philip was a man obsessed with consolidating royal authority, and he saw the Templars not as loyal servants of Christendom, but as an arrogant, independent state within his own borders. Their staggering wealth was a constant temptation to a king perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy. The Templars' own diplomatic maneuvers became a desperate, high-stakes game of survival. They continued their appeals to Clement, reminding him of their 2 centuries of service and their direct subordination to the papacy alone. Simultaneously, they attempted cautious, back-channel overtures to the French court, hoping to appease the king's anger and perhaps renegotiate their massive financial ties. But they were trying to play both sides in a game where one player held all the weapons. King Philip was not interested in negotiation. He wanted submission, and more than that, he wanted their gold. The Templars were no longer masters of the diplomatic chessboard. They had become the most valuable piece on it, fought over by a pope who wanted to protect them and a king who was determined to capture them. Their every move was now reactive, a frantic defense against a trap that was closing around them. This was the ultimate test of their statecraft, and for the first time in their long history, their legendary connections and financial power were not enough to save them. The very autonomy that had been their greatest strength was now the reason a king had marked them for destruction. A seasoned commander rode into a trap, believing he was entering a negotiation. Grand Master Jacques de Molay arrived in France in 1307, summoned to discuss the future of the Crusades with Pope Clement V. He was the living embodiment of the order, a man who had spent his life in its service, and he came prepared to fight for its survival with the only weapons he truly understood: reason and reputation. He launched a final, desperate diplomatic counter-offensive. He met repeatedly with the Pope, a man he still considered his ultimate protector, presenting detailed arguments that defended the order's sacred mission and its financial probity. He denounced the vile rumors being whispered by King Philip's agents as the slander of envious men. To prove the Templars had nothing to hide, de Molay made a stunningly bold offer. He formally requested a papal investigation, volunteering to open the order's legendary financial ledgers for full and transparent scrutiny. This was the act of a leader confident in his institution's integrity, a traditional, honorable response to a public relations crisis. He was playing by the old rules of chivalry and church diplomacy, believing that truth and transparency would be his shield, but the king was no longer playing that game. While de Molay was earnestly presenting his case in Avignon, Philip the Fair was finalizing secret orders that would be sent to every bailiff and seneschal in France. The Grand Master's noble, above-board efforts were a magnificent charge against an enemy that had already dug tunnels beneath his feet. His diplomacy, though principled and powerful, was tragically obsolete, a relic of a world where power still had some respect for process. He was trying to win a debate while the king was preparing a massacre. The secret absolutions were signed and sealed in the fortress of Chinon, then locked away from the world. In a private meeting during the summer of 1308, a papal commission led by 3 cardinals interrogated the imprisoned Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and his highest-ranking officers. After days of intense, confidential testimony, the cardinals reached a stunning conclusion. They granted the Templar leaders full absolution, reconciling them with the Church and formally clearing them of the heresy charges. This was a monumental, behind-the-scenes diplomatic triumph for the order. Through the sheer force of their testimony and the weight of their established credibility, they had convinced the Pope's own representatives of their innocence. For a few brief months, it seemed their old-world methods of high-level negotiation and appeal to canonical law had worked. They had won in the one court that truly mattered, the court of their ultimate sovereign, the Pope. Yet this victory was about to be erased by a far more brutal reality. Pope Clement V, physically ailing and trapped in Avignon under the immense pressure of the French crown, made a fateful decision. He chose political survival over justice. He suppressed the Chinon parchment, hiding the evidence of the Templars' exoneration, and in 1312, he officially dissolved the order through a papal bull. The truth of their absolution would remain a buried secret for centuries. This was the ultimate diplomatic betrayal, a moment where the machinery of statecraft broke down completely. It revealed a chilling new reality, where legal innocence and hard-won papal vindication meant nothing against the determined will of a secular king. The Templars had mastered the art of negotiation for 200 years, but they could not negotiate with a power that refused to play by any rules at all. Their final, quiet victory in a castle chamber was rendered meaningless by the louder, cruder forces of political expediency, a sobering lesson on the limits of influence in the face of raw, unchecked ambition. The dissolution of the order did not end the struggle, it merely changed the battlefield from courtrooms to treasuries. A vast, unclaimed fortune now lay scattered across Europe, a prize that set off a diplomatic feeding frenzy. Kings, nobles, and rival military orders all turned their gaze to the spoils, their hunger for the Templars' wealth laid bare. In an attempt to impose order and channel these resources toward a new crusade, Pope Clement V issued the papal bull Ad Providum. This decree officially transferred the vast majority of Templar properties and assets to their longtime rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. On paper, it was a clean, logical solution. In reality, it was a declaration of a different kind of war. The Hospitallers suddenly found themselves in a desperate scramble to claim their inheritance. A sprawling network of farms, castles, and commanderies they had no hope of securing without local support. And that support was not forthcoming. In the kingdoms of Iberia, where the fight against Muslim powers was a daily reality, local monarchs simply refused to hand over Templar fortresses they considered vital to national defense. They mounted legal challenges, dragging out the transfer process for years in royal courts they controlled. In parts of Germany and Italy, powerful nobles used outright force, sending their own knights to occupy Templar lands and daring the Hospitallers or the distant Pope to do something about it. The process of transferring this wealth became a complex diplomatic battlefield in its own right. A continent-wide scramble that revealed the true, staggering extent of the Templars' integrated European network. Every contested estate, every seized chest of silver, was a testament to the Order's vanished power. Their dismantling did not just enrich their rivals, it fundamentally reshaped the financial and political landscape of the continent for decades, redirecting the flow of capital and influence into new, often more nationalistic hands. This chaotic division of their legacy was the final, messy proof of their reach, a ghost of their influence lingering long after the last knight was gone. While other European kings scrambled for the spoils, one monarch chose a different path entirely. In Portugal, King Diniz I looked upon his Templar allies not as heretics to be crushed, but as the very foundation of his kingdom's security and future. For decades, they had been his most reliable border guards, their formidable castles forming a defensive line against Moorish incursions from the south. Their agricultural and economic expertise had turned barren lands into prosperous estates, filling the royal coffers. To destroy them would be to willfully cripple his own realm. So King Diniz did not persecute, he negotiated. he launched a discreet but determined diplomatic campaign aimed squarely at the papal court in Avignon. His argument was one of pure pragmatism, not theology. He acknowledged the Pope's decree to dissolve the Templars, but he presented a brilliant solution, a seamless transition of power. He proposed the immediate creation of a brand new military order, one that would be utterly loyal to the Portuguese crown, yet still operate under the papal umbrella. This was a masterstroke, offering Pope Clement V a face-saving way to preserve a vital military asset in Iberia without directly defying the French crown. After years of careful negotiation, the strategy succeeded. In 1319, the papal bull Ad Ex Quibus formally established the Order of Christ. This was not a mere name change, it was a legal and diplomatic resurrection. The new order absorbed every Portuguese Templar knight, every squire, every asset, and every single one of their legendary fortresses, including the iconic headquarters at Toma. The transition was so smooth it was virtually administrative. The same men who had worn the Red Cross of the Templars now wore the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, performing the same duties under the same commanders. This was the single most successful diplomatic outcome of the entire dissolution, a negotiated survival that allowed the Templar institution to continue its work uninterrupted. And that work was about to take on a new, world-altering dimension. The Order of Christ, infused with the Templar spirit of exploration and backed by their accumulated wealth, became the spiritual and financial engine of the Portuguese age of discoveries. Prince Henry the Navigator, a Grand Master of the Order, used its vast resources to fund the caravels that sailed into the unknown. The Knights' advanced knowledge of navigation, cartography, and finance, all hallmarks of their Templar heritage, were now directed across the oceans. Their cross sailed on the sails of Portuguese ships, a silent banner guiding a nation to a global empire. In this one kingdom, through the foresight of a clever king and the enduring power of their own reputation, the Templars did not die. They simply set sail, redirecting the fate of the world from the deck of a ship. These 23 moments reveal a startling truth about the Knights Templar. They were far more than warriors. They were master diplomats whose quiet negotiations often left a more permanent mark on history than any battle they ever fought. Their true power was not in the flash of a sword, but in the subtle art of the deal, conducted in hushed chambers and encoded in sealed letters. They brokered peace between kings and sultans, secured thrones for child monarchs, and managed the vast financial engines of emerging nations. Their influence flowed through whispered counsel in royal courts and the silent, undeniable weight of gold in their vaults. The dramatic fall of the order, orchestrated by a king desperate to break free from their financial grip, did not erase this profound legacy. Instead, it scattered their methods and their mindset. The very tools they perfected, international banking, neutral mediation, and state-level financial management, were absorbed by the rising powers of Europe. The modern state, with its complex treasuries and diplomatic corps, was built in part upon a foundation the Templars laid. Their story is a timeless lesson in the nature of power, reminding us that the currents of history are often redirected not by the loudest voices on the battlefield, but by the quietest hands in the counting house and the council chamber. If you found this journey into the secret corridors of history fascinating, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments which of these quiet Templar maneuvers did you find most surprising.